Good evening, and welcome to Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. My name is Richard Nephew, and I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, which is hosting this event. It is also the very first public event of the International Security Program at the Center, which I lead. And so I'm very honored and pleased that our first such event is going to be so focused on the geopolitical outlook for the next 18 months or so. It's also quite fitting for this event. We have brought along so many former colleagues from the U.S. intelligence community to help us figure things out. Tonight's event will be moderated by Mike Dempsey, the former acting director of national intelligence and now a non-resident fellow with the center and the program. Mike is now a retired career intelligence officer, having begun his time in the intelligence community in 1990 when he joined the Central Intelligence Agency. Since that time, he's served in a number of management and analytical positions there, including Director of the Office of Transnational Issues, Director of the Office of African, Latin American, and Global Issues, and Deputy Associate Director of CIA for Military Affairs. He also served as Deputy CIA Representative to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was Director of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. In 2014, though, he moved to the Office of the DNI, where he served as the Deputy Director of National Intelligence and as President Obama's primary intelligence briefer. Without further ado, I will turn things over to Mike to introduce his fellow panelists, to offer a few remarks, and to open our discussion. Mike?
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. So we're going to have an informal discussion tonight. So feel free when we get to the question and answer part, don't be shy. There's no bad question for us. So this evening we're going to look at geopolitics over the course of the next 18 months to 2 years, and I'll introduce our panelists shortly. Let me say this event is being webcast live, and full video will be available on Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy website within the next few days. And for those of you watching online, as well as people here in the audience, you can ask a question for the panelists at any time. Using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at ColumbiaU Energy. So as we meet here tonight, I'm sure we're all struck by the scale of the challenges we face globally. We'll hear from our panelists about some flashpoints that they're particularly worried about, and I think we could probably spend the entire evening just talking about global hotspots. But there are some critical overarching issues that form the backdrop to this discussion. Being newly liberated from the government and free of the tyranny of the moment, I've had a few months to think about those, so I do want to spend some time thinking about those tonight as well. So to name but a few, I'll just raise these for you up front. I think we're going to need to answer as a country and as a global community at some point soon, what is America's desired engagement strategy with the world? Are we still committed to promoting liberal democracy and openness? And are we interested in advancing a new set of international norms in such areas as arms control, cyber, election meddling, and trade, for example? Or are we now mainly interested in focusing on a narrower range of domestic issues? I'm not going to tell you which way I lean, but that kind of seems where we're at. And this has been a debate within U.S. foreign policy over decades. Seems to me now we're swinging a little more rapidly than we have in the past. And we don't feel, to me, like we're in between the 40-yard lines. Also, does America continue to place the same value on the current network of global alliances established over the past 70 years? In other words, do we have shared interests that make it acceptable for some allies to pay more for defense or carry trade deficits with us in certain instances? Or are we going to now adopt a different style of engagement with our traditional allies? In addition, can the U.S. remain a dominant international actor and secure while carrying $1 trillion deficit? Similarly, what does America's and indeed the world's energy future look like, and are we acting responsibly now to safeguard it? Along these lines, are we in the West focusing too much on defense spending levels and not thinking deeply enough about developing and incorporating the new technologies that will have an outsized effect on each nature's future security? Are we at the point that technological capabilities are outpacing strategy norms and potentially morals? Also, is it likely that in today's array of international challenges can go addressed for too many more years without eventually spilling over borders and forcing us collectively into much more difficult resolution strategies? Particularly what I'm talking about there is, are we collectively running out of time to get ahead of potential global health pandemics, climate change, and the current internally displaced crisis. So on the latter point, are we creating a lost generation that we're going to all collectively hear from later? And then finally, 18 years on from 9/11, is the West succeeding in creating the conditions for a lessening of the international terrorist threat? Are we adjusting the legal authorities and the relevant agencies' missions to counter the clear and present threat from homegrown extremism? So that's the backdrop to the discussion tonight. We're going to talk more about particular regions that the panelists are focused on, but I do think it's worth thinking up front about some of those broad issues because we're going to have to deal with them sooner or later. So I invite you, our audience and panelists, to engage the discussion tonight and to leverage this world-class institution and its resources to tackle both the crises at hand and the deeper challenges ahead. I'm honored to be here tonight with Chris Almond, the Defense Intelligence Officer for the Middle East, Professor Richard Betts, the Arnold A. Saltzman Professor of War and Peace Studies, Director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and Director of the International Security Policy Program here at CEPA, Scott Bray, the National Intelligence Manager for East Asia, and Shelby Pearson, the Intelligence Community's Election Security Executive and former National Intelligence Manager for Russia, Europe, and Eurasia. So how we're going to do this, I've asked the panelists to provide a few words up front about the key challenges and issues shaping their areas of responsibility. So 5 to 10 minutes each, kind of on what keeps them up at night. And then afterwards, I'll ask a few questions of the panelists, but we'll get very quickly to the audience questions. Again, for those here in person, when we turn to the audience for questions, please raise your hand if you have a question and we'll bring a microphone. And for those watching online, you can use the hashtag CGEP events, and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy to ask a question. So, without any more introduction, Chris, let's start with you.
Okay. Can you hear me? The United States Air Force taught me how to brief without a microphone, and so I have a tendency to overwhelm these things. So they teach you what's known as command voice because fighter pilots tend to fall asleep during briefings. So I hope you can all hear me, and we're not going to get any sudden feedback out of this thing. I was asked, as Mike mentioned, to talk about what keeps me up at night in the Middle East. And I'll start out with a bit of an anecdote. You're probably laughing when you say what keeps you up at night, when someone says what keeps you up at night in the Middle East, because it's the Middle East. But I'll start with an anecdote from my first day, probably my first week at DIA back in 2001, just after 9/11. I was hired as an Iran air defense analyst, kind of a narrow portfolio, and I sat down with my senior analyst to talk about Iran in the region, and I'll never forget Randall Bentley looking me in the eye, and he says, "Chris, these problems will put our kids through college." And so, 15 years later, as I was driving down I-81 South to take my son to the University of Kentucky to study agricultural economics, I remember turning onto I-64 to head to Lexington and thinking, son of a biscuit, Randall was right. And I'm glad I phrased that correctly because public affairs would have had me hoisted on a petard. But it's true. I mean, I have filled two 529s on the problems out of the that have come out of the Middle East over the last 18 years. Doing the Middle East, working the Middle East, is like doing national security laundry. You take a load out of the dryer, you fold it, you put it into the drawer, you think you're done, you turn around, you look in the hamper, and there's the next problem. Just to kind of walk you through what it's been like for me during my career, just at DIA, and this is after I got out of uniform. Starting in 2003 was kind of my first major crisis, and that was Iraq, the invasion, the occupation. That went on for 8 years and ended in 2011. In the middle of that, before that was even over, we had in 2006 the war between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel, which threatened to blow up into a larger regional conflagration. Fortunately, the Iranians and Syrians never got involved, and it kind of stayed localized. But still, for a while there, things were, as we like to say, sporty. As we were winding down in Iraq, things actually turned out better than a lot of us thought, especially back in 2006. A little thing called Arab Spring came along, and you're all probably familiar with that. Six different countries within the Middle East, within a matter of months, either collapsed, their governments collapsed, or they teetered on the brink and were plunged into civil war. 3 of them were aligned with the U.S., Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen. Their governments all collapsed and were replaced with new governments, some of them democratically elected. Bahrain teetered on the brink and probably would have collapsed if it hadn't been for the Saudis' intervention. And then there was Libya and Syria, which both plunged into a civil war, and which are still going on to this day, and we're living with the implications of both of those right up to the present day. While those two civil wars were going on, and we were still dealing with those in the Middle East area of responsibility, which, by the way, let me just define this before we get to question and answer. For me, that's Egypt to Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, so you can kind of forget about the rest of, if you're thinking about Q&A, the rest of North Africa and Afghanistan, and when we get to that portion of the program. In 2014, a little group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had rebranded itself into the Islamic State in Iraq and Al-Sham, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, captured Mosul, routed 3 Iraqi security force divisions, and basically weren't stopped until they got to the gates of Baghdad, and created, thanks to the chaos in Syria and the chaos they created in Iraq, a proto-state 3/4 the size of Pennsylvania that seemed to become the obsession of the United States national security community for the next three and a half years. But wait, there's more in 2014, because one of those democratically elected governments that came out of Arab Spring, President Hadi's government in Yemen, was swept out of Sana'a and basically out of the most important parts of the country, the western spine of Yemen, in 2014 by what a friend of mine in UK Defense Intelligence calls wild men from the hills, the Houthis, who are an offshoot of Shia Islam, which led to the Saudi intervention in 2015, which they won. They were going to try to put Hadi back in power, but also was done because the Saudis feared that the Houthis would draw closer to the Iranians, which ironically is exactly what happened after the Saudi-led coalition went into Yemen, which may or may not have happened without that intervention. Now, underlying all of this is the subject that's nearest and dearest to my heart, and probably Richard's and Professor Betz's as well, and that's Iran. Because throughout this entire period, we dealt with a number of issues that emanated out of Tehran. There was the nuclear program. All through the 2000s, especially, what is the status of the program? What is the status of weaponization in Iran? What are the odds that we or someone else, a third party, might try to strike the program? There was the provision of weapons to Shia militias in Iraq that killed 603 Americans. We know that because my office was the one that did the study that determined which how many Iranian casualties were attributable to Iranian-supplied weapons, which were supplied to Shia militias with the intent of killing Americans. That obviously was a major issue within the Pentagon, within the national security community. And then there was just Iran's regional ambitions, facilitated in large part to the chaos that was present in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen. And then because I work for the Defense Department and the National Defense Strategy tells me that Russia and China are our top priorities, even I in the Middle East, a job working in the Middle East, has to acknowledge the role of Russia and China in the region. Russia, mainly on the security side, China, primarily at the moment at least, and Scott may touch on this a little bit when he speaks, political and economic, though they are making inroads into trying to establish security and defense relations with many of including friendly nations within the Middle East. So that's quite a lot to set the table. You'll notice I didn't even mention the ongoing low-level insurgency in the Sinai. Now, if you think about that for a moment, you have the largest Arab state in the Middle East, Egypt, with the insurgency on their soil, on the border with Israel, one of our primary, if not the primary ally and partner in the region, in a piece of land that butts up against one of the most strategic waterways in the world, the Suez Canal, and it doesn't even make my top 5, which just goes to show you what it is that we deal with every day when we deal with national. And this is what I mean about national security laundry, is there's a constant drumbeat of crises, in just about every portion of the region. So what have we learned? We've learned the Middle East is a mess. We've learned that Randall was and is right. And for any of you who are looking to make the Middle East your career, I can guarantee maybe you'll look back in 15, 16, 20 years and you'll say, Chris was right. These problems have put your kids through college as well, because I don't see any end in sight. Maybe the pace of these problems will continue, maybe the nature of them will continue, but this will continue to be a volatile part of the world, and it will continue to or capture the attention of policymakers, Republican and Democrat, for administrations to come. Finally, you may have guessed, I didn't say it explicitly, but you probably inferred, I'm kind of tired. This is a relentless pace of different conflicts, crises, national security problems. I'm actually thinking about, after this is over, asking Scott for a job, because even though China is the #1 priority for the U.S. in national security, at least it's not quite as frenetic as the Middle East. So we'll be talking afterwards. I'll maybe have to buy you a drink, or we'll see. But that was, I didn't really kind of talk about where we're going in the next 12 to 18 months. I think we can leave that for discussion. But I kind of wanted to set the table so you can kind of understand where we have been going, especially since 9/11 in this region, and just what it is to deal with national security problems. That all, by the way, impact on energy policy, to bring it back to our host tonight. So with that.
So Chris was very busy, and then when I was the deputy DNI and acting DNI, I would tell him, feel free to take all day Sunday off. Okay,
Appreciate that.
so now we will pivot. Scott will talk to us about your concerns.
Pivot, that's a tough word on Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
How's that working out
Get
for
you
you?
right there. So first, it's great to be back at CEPA. I graduated from CEPA 21 years ago. It took 21 years to invite me back. Thanks for finally inviting me back. But it's great to be here.
It actually took Scott 21 years to graduate. But.
As Mike said, I'm the National Intelligence Manager for East Asia. So what does that mean? National Intelligence Manager is the Assistant Secretary level senior intelligence official on a particular issue, responsible for our analysis, our collection, our counterintelligence, our budgeting and programming, and our foreign partnerships on the region. And East Asia, I got to tell you, is a pretty remarkable region to have that responsibility for. I've been doing this for 7 years, and I'll tell you, over that 7 years, what has stood out the most and what continues to stand out is that it is a remarkably dynamic region. It is a region of tectonic shifts that we have seen just in the past decade, in the past 5 years alone, in terms of the shifts in great power relationships that are happening there. And all of those shifts ultimately have global consequences for us. Some of those shifts that we see in East Asia are things that we've long anticipated. But even those things that we've long anticipated, I would argue, are having consequences and effects that we didn't necessarily understand as well until they actually began to unfold. And what I can tell you is, of all the things that we worry about globally, not just in East Asia, but globally, none of them have the same effect on the daily lives of Americans or on the future of our country as does the topic of China's emergence as a global power. And make no mistake about it, China has emerged as a global power. It is the world's second largest economy, or the first largest economy, depending on how you measure it. It's the world's largest manufacturer. It is a technology innovator, not just an imitator. Now, some of that innovation happens with, thanks to some ill-gotten intellectual property, but nonetheless, it is a technology innovator today. And all of those things, it has created a vast network of economic and diplomatic interests globally. And ultimately, that is what has always driven countries to develop a global power projection capability when they built it. In the past, that is always what it is. And the same is true for China today. So when I think about China, there are really three main concerns that I have. The first one is, as Vice President Pence has said, we are now engaged in global competition with China. And global competition is the important part of this, because it used to be that the things that we were worried about in China were in China. But today, the playing field on which we are concerned about China is Africa, or Southeast Asia, or Latin America, or Europe, or the Middle East. It's the rest of the world. The playing field is there, and so that's the place that the answers that we are looking for we usually find. That's the place that the actual diplomatic engagements are happening. It's those places that these dynamics that we're most concerned about are actually unfolding. And the second piece of global competition with China that's so interesting for us is this isn't like any type of global competition we've ever had before, for two reasons. One, this is not global competition that primarily unfolds in the military and security domains. This is a global competition that unfolds in the economic and in the trade domains. Second, we're in global competition with a country that we still depend on economic performance and economic growth in. So it's a different type of global competition in which there is an interdependencies that we count on. And that makes all of the China challenge all the more challenging. The second piece that I'm concerned about on China has to do with influence. And that comes really in two primary forms. First, there is the economic influence that China has because of a number of legitimate activities that Beijing has going on around the world. Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is a lot of infrastructure investment in a lot of places that need infrastructure investment. That's a good thing. No one could have concerns about that, so long as the quality is good and the terms of those investments are positive. But when it comes to the terms of those investments, in some places they are creating unsustainable debts that causes a lot of concern for us because a high level of indebtedness, a high degree of debt instability in some of these parts of the world ultimately challenge our interest and, frankly, I think the interest of all of us. Second, there is a piece of some of these investments as it creates unsustainable debt that can also foster governance practices that we are not fond of or foster higher levels of corruption. Why? Because generally speaking, U.S. investments, U.S. loans have come with requirements about transparency, about the terms of those, about governance types of requirements. Beijing's loans don't come with that. And so while it may not be that Beijing is directly exporting corruption or directly exporting an authoritarian system of government, it does make things easier for those countries in which corruption is rampant or in which there are authoritarian tendencies. It makes it easier for those governments to continue to exist under those conditions. And ultimately what that means is that it has the potential, and already is, reversing trends that we had seen for years that were trending towards democratization globally. So that obviously is of concern for us. The second piece of influence that's of concern isn't in those countries where it's loans, where corruption is an issue, or regular infrastructure investments, but rather it's influence that is much bolder, even in an advanced democracy. We saw that in Australia. I will leave a lot of the details of this to Shelby, but ultimately, in the end, we don't know how far China is willing or interested in going to influence things in the United States beyond normal diplomatic means of influence. But that is something that we are clearly concerned about. The third piece that I am concerned about on China, how can you not be concerned ultimately in great power competition about some sort of military conflict? I'm not worried about missiles inbound from China. I'm not worried that a decision will be made in Beijing or Washington to go to war with the other. But that's not how great power conflict usually happens. It usually happens because something much smaller on a tactical level happens and things sort of accelerate from there. And so when you have two great powers that are operating in similar spaces with different interpretations of international law, then it is all the easier for a tactical event to unfold where both countries believe that they are doing what is right, what is legal, and what is in their national interest, and things begin to accelerate from there. So obviously, I, like everyone else, I think, has some concern about a military conflict unfolding with China. So while China may be the thing that keeps me up at night, North Korea is the thing that wakes me up at night. 2 o'clock in the morning phone call, it's either your college son or it's North Korea. It's usually North Korea, because they don't ask me for a check like my son does. So on North Korea, here's what I'm most concerned about. I'm most concerned that while we have the potential for engagement, the underlying conditions that have got us to where we are still the same. We still judge that North Korea is not interested in willingly forfeiting its nuclear program. That does not mean that diplomats can't get them there, but at this time, we don't believe that Kim Jong-un is interested in that. And what I worry about is that Kim Jong-un ultimately doesn't realize the uniqueness of the opportunity that's before him here. He has a remarkably unique period of history in which he can make concessions in order to denuclearize that can lead to a very different outcome for the Korean Peninsula than what we have seen for decades and decades there. Finally, the last issue that keeps me up at night, and honestly this is the one that I worry about as much as the China one, and it's the future of our alliances and partnerships, similar to what you brought up. Why? Because our alliances and partnerships truly are the thing that the United States, it's the advantage that we have when it comes to global competition. Competing with China on a global scale is not easy. It takes capability and capacity. And through those partners is where we get unique capabilities, and it's certainly where we get capacity. And East Asia is home to some great allies. It's home to Australia. It's home to Japan. It's home to some really fantastic allies. But it's also home to a place where many of our alliances are facing particular strains. Our alliance with South Korea now under strains as we renegotiate the special measures agreement about how we, about the financial arrangements of U.S. military presence there. And then the relationship between our two critical Northeast Asian allies, between Tokyo and Seoul, is further strained by the fact that Seoul's decided to terminate the JSOMIA, their military intelligence sharing agreement. Now, we believe in our community very strongly that intelligence relationships are a foundation of relationships on which you build other things. And never do you let political issues or history issues or trade issues or anything else impact those intelligence relationships. And in this case, it has. So our alliances are feeling strains. And as China's economic might continues to grow, then Beijing will have the ability to make our allies and our partners feel even more pressure. They've made Seoul feel that before when we deployed THAAD to South Korea because of legitimate concerns that we had about North Korean missile capabilities, and China, and suddenly latte stores throughout China were closed for inspections. So China has made our allies feel pressure before because of those alliances, and as China's economic might and influence grows, the opportunities for that pressure to increase only grow. And so ultimately, the thing that I worry the most about is in that period of this period of global competition, what happens if our allies are in a place where they can't be that same anchor for our strategy because of economic reasons or political reasons or demographic reasons? That's the part that keeps me up the most at night. So with that.
It's very uplifting.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Scott. Shelby.
And to continue on that trajectory, let's talk about election security. So I think we're a bit midway through our talk, so I thought I would start with some audience participation. How many of you are intending to vote in 2020? Okay. Scott? Scott. How many of you are confident in the source and sponsorship of the information you consume to inform your vote? It's like 4 very lovely people. I'll talk to you afterwards. So when you think about what keeps me up at night, and when you think about the work of election security, it really is an issue of confidence. It really is both the confidence of the American people in our democratic processes, that a vote cast is a vote counted. It's the confidence that the information that we're consuming is, if not truthful, at least the source of that information is discoverable to you. And I think we're nugging through right now, not only as the intelligence community, but frankly as a society, and I'm delighted that Scott also mentioned the importance of our partners, because this is not uniquely an American problem. This is an international problem. And so both Chris and Scott have laid some great planks for me this afternoon, because election security is both just a moment in time when we are thinking about an election, but it is also across the arc of foreign influence, where countries, and again, I'll talk in a bit about China and Iran, and as the former National Intelligence Manager for Russia, each of these countries, and for many, many years, well before 2016, foreign influence did not begin in 2016, engage in all kinds of activities with, for, and against the United States. And so it's in fact the study of what is that landscape between the US and other countries and across the globe, about where and when they choose to exert that influence. Is it overt to us, or is it concealed from us, which is primarily where we spend a lot of our time. And I think taking that a step further is, what does that do to undermine confidence within a society if you don't totally understand the landscape of information ahead of you? So it's great to have my colleagues, I think, who speak from a regional perspective, because election security and foreign influence sort of wraps all of the issues that we're going to talk about this evening. I wanted to provide just a bit of historical context. It's no surprise to many of you that someone who worked closely with Mike on the Russia problem set also happens to now be working election security. I think it was my second or third week on the job as the National Intelligence Manager for Russia when President Obama asked the intelligence community to write the assessment that was declassified for the public's consumption on Russian interference in the 2016 election. And so that sort of galvanized, I think, the intelligence community and also specifically the Russia community to further study this problem. But as we go forward working this today, it's not just a Russia problem. It's a China problem. It's an Iran problem. It's a North Korea problem. It's a hacktivist problem. It's a non-state actor problem. In 2018, we saw a number of foreign actors, as I mentioned, including Russia, China, and Iran, frankly, spanning the geopolitical landscape and for very, very different motivations, conducting influence campaigns aimed at undermining confidence in democratic institutions. However, leading up to the midterms, as many of you know, we said this publicly several times, we saw no evidence of disruption or compromise of election infrastructure in order to prevent voting or change votes or disrupt the ability to tally votes. And in fact, relative to 2018, I think it was announced today, if I'm not mistaken, that the Treasury Department continues its additional sanctions against Russia in this regard in terms of the activities that Mr. Prigozhin sponsored relative to midterm interference. And yet, here we go into 2020, and I think there certainly is a tremendous amount of energy in the intelligence community, in the US government, in the private sector, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And I hope I'll address a bit about where I think academia fits in to election security. For the purposes of our discussion today, I really look at election security, one, as I said, against the backdrop of foreign influence writ large, but really in three different domains. First and foremost is foreign direct interference in election infrastructure. So that is focused on federal, state, and local infrastructure that is designed to alter vote tallies. And I think all of us can appreciate why that is a paramount priority for us in the intelligence community, because it is the most important activity that we as a society participate in relative to our democracy. Second is also the direct targeting and of the internal information and communications of political parties and campaigns. What you might know that as is hack and dump operations, where through cyber means or through other acquisition methods, adversaries seek to gather sensitive information and then use that for political purposes. And again, that's activity that certainly, as it's sponsored, it can be sponsored by foreign actors, particularly foreign intelligence services, remains a priority for us in the intelligence community. And then the third area, which gets a lot of attention in fact, beyond the first two that I mentioned, is foreign influence operations. And that can take many, many forms that you're familiar with, social media efforts, and also, as Scott mentioned, traditional influence operations that could impact think tanks and academia. And this is really, I think, a trend line where we need to have further discussion about what is the broad base of information operations, how are those executed, and who's responsible. And I would argue all of us have a responsibility, depending on your role and participation in countering these activities. And the word for that is resilience, frankly, right? Where we are less effective of a target for our adversaries, where we're constantly checking our sources, we're looking for accurate venues for information, but frankly, when you're looking at state-sponsored information on social media or through any other areas, you're questioning those sources in a way that makes them less effective in their sponsorship. As we go into 2020, just as a bit of an update, and I'll round out my comments with this and another point about academia's role in this area. As I have foot-stomped several times before, based upon the current information that we have today, we do not believe that we have any foreign adversaries have an intention to specifically disrupt or corrupt the elements of the electoral process or infrastructure such as the voting machines, the e-poll books, the voter tally systems in the 2020 general elections. However, as we've mentioned both in my colleagues' comments, the fractious nature of the geopolitical relationship between the United States and others makes elections a potential opportunity for any of these countries where if things are bad enough, if I can put it that way, what does an election do to provide an opportunity for an adversary to affect the geopolitical landscape of the United States and more broadly internationally? In particular, as it relates to election infrastructure, I do want to highlight, when you think about what keeps me up at night, is this issue of ransomware. I think we've seen a particular increase in ransomware. Many of you have seen this reported in your local press. This has been a quite common occurrence at the most local level, and this was something that wouldn't surprise me, even if it's not state-sponsored. Someone could take control of related infrastructure right in the days before an election to where we're not able to successfully execute, and that's where redundancy and backups come in so that your state and local election officials can continue to certify the results despite a ransomware event. But this is a particularly challenging area at the local level. From the foreign influence perspective, unfortunately, this continues to be a ripe domain for our adversaries. Russia continues to use social media and Russian-controlled influence, Russian-controlled or influenced English language media, false flag personas, sympathetic spokespeople, and other tools to inflame positions on both ends of issues, which I find interesting, where it's really on both sides of a particular issue to create further divisiveness within the United States. As Scott mentioned, China funds several English language media outlets to influence operations of Beijing and influences Chinese language print and broadcast media in the United States to influence the domestic political environment, particularly, again, as we heard earlier, to promote their interests in policy preferences, specifically on trade and economic relations, so no surprise to you. And lastly, as I know my Middle East colleagues recognize that Iran is also increasing their use of social media to promote strategic goals and perspectives to the American public, and its influence campaigns have included denigrating the United States' decision to withdraw from JCPOA, downplaying the effectiveness of Iranian sanctions, and promoting pro-Iranian interests. What's interesting to me about each of these vignettes, Russia, China, and Iran, is that they also seem to play out regionally as well. So these are not just tactics and techniques that we see focused solely on the United States. Obviously, Scott is seeing this relative to Hong Kong. Iran has a long history of regional influence operations, and of course, Russia has long seen its issues with its sphere of control in Europe. So for us, what are we doing about it? I wanted to conclude with this concept of how we improve resilience. To me, I think as much as we want to protect the infrastructure of our election systems, I think it is also important, particularly given the effectiveness of influence operations, that we as a society, and in fact, some of the most effective European countries at countering disinformation operations really have a whole of society cognizance about this behavior and tend to incorporate it in their education systems and their political systems, and it's a real whole of society effort to counter these issues. So for me, I think from the intelligence community, we spend a lot of time on information sharing. I think one of our top goals is to ensure that when we have information from our sources, that that is shared at the state and local level, but it goes beyond that, that it's also shared with, I think, this concept that I'm trying to nurture a bit right now, which is the election security ecosystem. And I think it's something that I'd welcome questions or further consideration on your part. When I think about the election security ecosystem, it really has three different wedges. One is the US federal space, the government space, which goes all the way down to state and local election officials. And that's merely one dimension of organizations that are responsible for election security and countering influence operations. But there are whole other entities in this landscape and players that we need to be working with, communicating with, sharing with, and again, creating an ecosystem of shared responsibility, so because it doesn't solely rest on the shoulders of the government. The second wedge of that triangle or that ecosystem is social media firms, private industry. We have many cybersecurity firms who might see a threat well before I do in intelligence channels. You also have the platform owners and private tech firms. And so again, a whole private industry area that is certainly an active and important player on this field. And then lastly, it's really important, specifically being here at Columbia University, that this issue of civil society. I cannot stress to you enough the importance that I see in terms of civil society, which includes, of course, academia, the public, interest groups, that entire, I think, wellness of society in which we are studying this problem and we're looking at it from a diversity of angles. That's work that isn't done by the government necessarily. And so I think there are some natural inroads and partnerships where, again, this ecosystem can be nourished over time. I'll conclude by saying this. There's a lot being discussed about election security. It's certainly a very timely topic. But if there's one thing that you walk away from this evening, I want to share with you the confidence that I have that election security is a top priority for the intelligence community. That has remained unchanged, and my colleagues can affirm that, and they know that this has been a trajectory for us since 2016 that frankly has remained unperturbated. And I think that's part of the stability that the intelligence community and the government brings. And so lastly, we remain focused on sharing information as best we can, and that's always a difficult balancing act. But it is our commitment that we will continue to support elections that are conducted with the greatest integrity, confidence, and without foreign interference, not only going into 2020, but and beyond. So I welcome your questions and discussions on a topic that frankly affects all of the domains we've discussed this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby. So we've asked Professor Betts to hit cleanup for us on the panel, and then we will, he'll share with us his thoughts about what he's heard and any other particular concerns he has, and then we'll get to questions. Professor Betts.
Well, as often happens when you're last on a panel with a lot of smart people, most of the important things have been said. So I will just take the opportunity to pontificate a little about my views of threats and opportunities that maybe cut across some of these realms. I think some issues of concern aren't either one, a threat or an opportunity. For example, prospects in Afghanistan. To me, that's a case of something that's more like a tragedy, a disaster that can't be avoided at an acceptable price, but more that than either a major threat or opportunity. It seems that we're headed for an American disengagement and probable by no means inevitable collapse of the Kabul government and some form of Taliban return to power, reversing some of the progressive gains in Afghan society, like the emancipation of women. So a tragedy for Afghanistan, but I think less a threat or opportunity for the United States, beyond the danger of its becoming a base for terrorism again, but a danger that's shared now with any number of other countries, making it less distinctive. But in terms of threats and opportunities, I tend to be a pessimist by instinct, maybe as revealed by what I just said, but I think most about prospective major threats to good international politics and U.S. interests. So I won't say much about opportunities in the short time available. I'd focus on two general types of threat. First, ones we recognize and prepare for. And preparing to prevent or defend against them reduces the odds that they'll eventuate. But the second type is wild cards, ones that are on no one's radar screens, but which can turn priorities upside down and which require big unplanned adjustments and costs. Now, in regard to the first type, I think a lot depends on whether the United States can get unstuck from the Middle East in some sense, which it's been trying to do for some time. If it can, I think the primary question of concern is how to reach a modus vivendi between the United States and China to prevent war, what theorists like Robert Gilpin conceptualize as a so-called war of hegemonic transition, a war over, say, a decision in Beijing to undertake the final resolution of the Chinese Civil War and reincorporate Taiwan by force. It's by no means inevitable, but I don't think peace is the default option. Peace will require some really careful arrangements and understanding about how to handle situations where American policy, I think so far, is still uncomfortably ambiguous. And where Beijing sees its stakes in the matter at issue as higher than Washington's. The United States hasn't yet, I think, faced the basic choice of emphasis on either containment or accommodation. And a lack of consensus, I think, or even serious discussion among the American foreign policy elite on what to do if China were to attack Taiwan. The second priority, I see as preventing a crisis and miscalculation over Russian interests in its near abroad, especially in the Baltic states, now proud members of NATO. How either to deter or defend against Russian action in, say, Estonia, that might be similar to what was done with little green men in Ukraine in 2014. And I'd cite the third and fourth priorities being North Korea, and farther behind than conventional wisdom assumes, Iran. And the fifth priority now, but which could become first if we fail, is to prevent terrorist groups like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda from getting efficiently usable weapons of mass destruction. But odds are that the biggest turning point is likely to be something not on anyone's list now, a wild card. And so why do I emphasize this so much? Bear with me and consider a half dozen questions. I mean, early 1950, who would have predicted that America's next war would be in a place called Korea, which most Americans couldn't find on a map at that time? And at the end of the Korean War, who would have predicted that America's next war would be in Vietnam? In 1988, who would have predicted, at least without being sent to a mental hospital, that within 3 years the Berlin Wall would crumble, the Cold War would end, the Soviet's Eastern European Empire would be liberated, and the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist? In early 1990, who would have predicted that America's next war would be against Iraq? And after that war in 1991, who would have predicted that 15 years later Iraq would be looking like Vietnam? Or on September 10th, 2001, who would have predicted that the United States would fight the longest war in its history in Afghanistan? I think the answer to those questions is virtually nobody. So it seems to me we need to focus on the 4 or 5 priorities I mentioned of potential threats that can be recognized, because preparing for them reduces the odds that they'll occur. And doing that in the Cold War via vigilance, deterrence, alliance diplomacy, and arms control avoided World War III. But we have to do that without having confidence that if we do a good job of preparing for those threats that we recognize, that we have things under control. And makes all important, too, to have a cushion of resources so we can afford to throw them at unanticipated problems when they arise. And that brings up a point that was mentioned, I believe, by our moderator in passing, whether trillion-dollar deficits are more of a problem than either of our political parties at the moment seems to think.
Is there anyone left who's not depressed? So what I'll do now is we have a few minutes I'll ask a few questions of the panel, and what I'll ask the panelists to do is keep the remarks to a minute or two, because I really do want to turn quickly to your questions. So the first question I'm going to ask Scott. So Scott, the last time that I remember in our history, and I could be wrong, but that the United States military was on the wrong side of a technological fight was probably the Kasserine Pass in the beginning of World War II. How do you rate right now China's military modernization, and are there areas where you're potentially worried that we may be falling behind?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thanks for not asking me about the Kasserine Pass, because I would have embarrassed myself in front of Professor Betts, and that would have not been the way I wanted to return to Columbia. So here's what without a doubt, there are technological places today in China's military that are not only cutting edge, but they are cutting edge by any definition that a modern military would apply to that. I spent a good bit of my career with naval intelligence, and back with naval intelligence, we used to go talk about the fact that Beijing was building a ballistic missile that they would fire from land that would hit a moving ship at sea. And there were times that you could just about get tossed out of the Pentagon any day for talking about some future thing that the Chinese were building that made them sound 10 feet tall. It was just impossible. But guess what? China's built that. It's an operational system today. They can do that. So for quite some time, there have been areas that Beijing has been building unquestionably cutting-edge technology. So today, when you look at Chinese developments in space, Chinese developments in counter space, and Chinese developments in hypersonics, I think those are 3 areas in particular that Beijing is now, in some places, leading the world in terms of their military technological developments.
Great. Chris, I was there in the last year of I think with Richard, of the Obama administration, and the year after the JCPOA was signed, the nuclear agreement, Iran's economy grew by about 12%. It grew by about 3 or 4% the year after that. 2018 contracted by 3%. This year, I think the forecast is 6% contraction. I think inflation's nearly 40%. The real's lost 60% of its value. How does maximum pressure end?
So, and that's a good question. And so if you take it as a given that the U.S. is committed to continuing the sanctions regime, and I've seen nothing that, and I don't have any special insights, but I've seen nothing that suggests that we're not going to continue down this path. And you take it as a given that Iran has no intention of negotiating under the current conditions, and for the foreseeable future, as they have stated, then there really are only 2 options. For Iran at least, and one is to push the bounds of the JCPOA restrictions, which the previous administration, Richard is among them, worked so hard to hammer out. And we've already seen some of that. For instance, IAEA has certified that Iran has exceeded the limit, the 300 kilogram limit on enriched uranium, for instance. So that's one outlet, and that is to try to convince folks that they've been forced into doing this, and therefore they have the international community put pressure on the United States to roll back or go back into JCPOA. And the other is to impose costs. And we have already seen that. And we have seen Iran attempting to impose costs, especially on those who it sees as the weak link in this coalition, if there is such a thing, and that's our Gulf partners and allies who are closest to the action, so to speak. And also at the same time, as we saw in this most recent fusillade that came out of Iran into Saudi Arabia, it's to raise the specter of future disruptions of global energy output. And that, as much as anything, not just to impose costs, I think, was Iran's intention in this last effort, was to not just, and we saw it reflected to some extent in the short term in terms of energy prices, to again raise that specter that they could do serious violence to world energy markets going forward. My concern is, and you get back to what keeps you up at night, is as these sanctions bite deeper, because they will continue, the Iranian economy will continue to contract along for the foreseeable future along the trend line that you identified, that Iran's desperation grows, and then therefore their risk tolerance, their level of risk tolerance gets higher and higher to the point where they do something to which someone, whether it's us, whether it's the Saudis, whether it's the Israelis, for instance, as a regional player, has to respond. And then we get ourselves into what we euphemistically call the escalation ladder, which is really just people shooting at each other with larger and larger weapons at greater and greater volume, which is never any good for anybody involved. And so that comes down, that really is, the concern is that's the path that we may be heading off in the long term.
I'm sure we'll come back to that in
Yep.
a minute or two. Shelby, you talked about the companies with social media focus. It's been a mixed bag in the relationship between the intelligence community and the U.S. government. Some of those firms, you could make the case either way for greater access to their technology or them keeping us at a distance. But how would you say that those firms in general are working with the U.S. government on election hardening?
We get asked this question a lot, certainly because not only are we challenged in the social media domain, but we also work with a variety of tech firms that provide the technical platforms for the state and local election officials. So they have both a role in the infrastructure piece, and then we have influence sponsored by the social media actors. So I think it has been on a positive trajectory, generally speaking, in terms of, and I think you've seen some of this referenced in some press reporting in terms of sharing of information from the intelligence community to help those firms understand activity that we see or that they may see on their platform that they can choose to act on relative to violations of their terms of service. From my perspective, I think this is a burgeoning additional opportunity for us in the government, because they also have, frankly, experts on the same threats that we have within the intelligence community. And so they know technology, they know their platforms, they see actors as well. And so I think there is an opportunity to get beyond potentially the transactional and also have, I think, information sharing in a way that both enhances security but can be done within the bounds of the legal framework that we have today, within the authorities that we have today, with the privacy considerations that I think we all share, and at the same time bringing, I think, a mutual perspective on innovation as well. So to me, I think there's opportunity here, but it is a carefully, as you know, Mike, choreographed engagement where I think what we're trying to do, and I think some of you saw some of recent press reporting on this, where we try to engage several agencies with the firms at one time. That's a bit innovative from where we've been before, where you have one organization and one agency getting together. I think what we want to do is have some cooperative relationships, because all of the federal agencies have different authorities, different interests, and different expertise, and we want to be able to holistically talk about election security and counter-influence together, and then begin to sort of discover where we can have further development of those relationships.
Okay, and then I do want to ask Professor Betts. We've spent the entire hour preceding looking really overseas and looking from our perspective outward. I want to ask your impression as a student of U.S. foreign policy, and not just limiting to this administration, we could go through the last few. Are you mainly concerned now, if you were looking at the problems plaguing the formation of U.S. foreign policy? Is it the bandwidth issue? Is it a lack of bipartisan cooperation? You can't answer all of the above here. I know where you're going. Is it resources? Is it kind of a strategy that swings in pendulum? Pendulum that's swinging more quickly than previously. I'm just for the audience, from your perspective, after working on these issues for years, what are you most concerned about the U.S. Our position, our formulation of policy?
Well, at least one longer term and one shorter term thing. The shorter term thing is, frankly, it's hard to avoid these days saying anything intelligent without revealing biases. But the short-term problem is the revolutionary political situation in Washington and the nature of the Trump administration, especially the chief executive himself, and the lack of reliability, consistency, all sorts of things. But the longer-term problem, and it's two-edged, it's not entirely a problem, but the fact that generally there's very little attention to foreign policy in the political system, especially since the Cold War. The foreign policy elite is, depending on how you measure it, something like 15% of the population, but it just doesn't register in public debate about what the nation's problems are. I mean, you see in the presidential debates, not just the current ones, but going back in the last few elections, you couldn't get a question on foreign policy. Now, if you had a sort of united, stable, intelligent elite, you could say, well, doesn't matter. We won't make that part of our politics so democratic with a small d. But polarization politically has complicated that too. Some positions on foreign policy, I think, now have been subordinated to the effects they all have on the internal domestic political balance of power.
Okay, so now we're going to turn to you. We have 30 minutes or so, and we're happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about. So I think you raise your hand, and then somebody brings a microphone to you. So let's start right in the front row. And if you would, actually just identify who you are. And I do want the students to ask questions. I see you hovering in the corners over there, but I'm going to call on you if you don't ask.
My name is Ed Houlihan. I live in Ridgewood, New Jersey. I'm a retired commander in the U.S. Navy, Vietnam veteran. What is your assessment of China and Russia in the Arctic? And what do you think the United States should do and is doing about it?
China and Russia.
Yeah, can you do
China and Russia.
in the what?
In the Arctic?
Oh, in the Arctic. In the Arctic. Okay. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, so I'll start. So first, without a doubt, China has a great interest in the Arctic. They've been interested in the Arctic for not just for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is just with melting of polar ice, what that means in terms of transit times to Europe. So China has a lot of interest there, considers itself a quasi-Arctic country. It's a observer to the Arctic Council. So China's watching very carefully what's happening there, and certainly has an interest in shaping outcomes. China has a research vessel that spends a fair amount of time in the Arctic, making sure that China has a good understanding of the environment there and conditions there and how they're changing. So China expects to be a part of decisions that are made about Arctic issues, whether it's has to do with melting ice and the opportunities that presents, or other issues. So, and I think without a doubt, China is the country not actually bordering the Arctic that is attempting to play the biggest role there. So, Shelby, I'll let you talk about the Russia piece.
Well, and as Scott mentioned, I think Russia sees itself as the primary actor in the Arctic because it is naturally within what they believe is their sphere of influence. And so I think there's almost an assumption, a presumption on the Russians' part that the Arctic is theirs. And you see that in terms of their assertions in the region, in terms of wanting to have warning so that they can guarantee safe passage in the region, whether that also has to do militarily with the operations in the high north, all the way to signing economic agreements with other countries in the region. I think and Scott and I have talked about this together as colleagues in our work, I think one of the things that we're wanting to understand is how to evolve the conversation for one that has been primarily focused on the environment and economics. But now that we have, unfortunately, further melting of the ice, you now have greater presence up there. You have greater opportunity for military presence as well. And I think wanting to evolve that discussion a little bit, but Russia certainly is with China in that this is their area, and they certainly want to have a presence there, and that is going to be a very contested problem and region for us, I think, in the future.
And what's hard about that is it had been for decades an area where there was cooperation. So
Right.
if we get into a situation where it becomes another area of military contestation, it's unfortunate. Next. Yep. We'll work backwards.
Hi, I'm a student here. I had a question on the election security kind of issues. So we saw in 2018 in the Des Moines Register that China was taking out ads to
Yes.
try to have because they have the skin in the game. So how does the intelligence community relate and cooperate with these local regional papers that they ensure, because all the Americans know from CNN or Fox News, these are caucuses, they're coming soon. So how do you help with that narrative?
So I think the most important thing for the intelligence community, and this gets back to, I think, this discussion that there's a shared space around election security, that we want to focus for the most part on that which is discoverable in the sources of information available to us, and that centers around foreign intelligence activity. And also, I think there's a heavier emphasis on that which is covert. So we want to be able to share information as broadly as we can when we know that foreign intelligence services are sponsoring covert-related activity. I think as Scott and I work on quite closely, this issue is, there's been a lot of Chinese activity that has gone on for decades that is not covert. Foreign influence is part and parcel, frankly, of just international engagement. And so I think, as we all acknowledge, we have engagement with the Chinese, and it's both dependent and central to our economy. And knowing that that trajectory has been a bit rocky over the past several months, it would be no surprise that, in fact, we have Chinese language newspapers and also the Chinese taking out ads to particularly sway the American public, given the impact of what's writing here. I think the issue for us is when that is really covert. And again, Scott, welcome your perspective on that.
No, I think obviously you've got it just right there. The real issue is just there are, if Beijing takes out an ad that everyone knows it's the Chinese government taking out an ad saying that a certain type of tariffs are going to have a disproportionate effect on you reading this ad. Well, that's, as long as everyone knows who wrote that
influence.
ad, right? That's influence, but it's it's what governments do. However, when if you're not sure who that source of information is, then things are different, which gets back to Shelby's first question about how confident are you about the sources of information that you have about these things. So, so I think we draw a pretty heavy line there between, like if you want to take an ad out and make your case to the American people as the Chinese government, well, that's one thing. But if you want to do it in a way that's that's not upfront, that's something different.
Okay. Let me go to the second row. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your talks. It has been very enlightening. My name is Rasmus Christensen. I'm an advisor to the Estonian UN mission, but actually of Danish descent. My question is probably for you, Scott. And you said that you're not afraid of China in a military sense, but and going back to energy, they don't really produce any oil or gas themselves, and so they have a fairly large stake in the Middle East. And now they have launched their first aircraft carriers. They have their own fighter jet technology. They are building their port in Gwadar in Pakistan. Do you see in the foreseeable future that they will engage more active in the Persian conflicts or in the Middle East?
Yeah, I'll tell you, somebody asked me one time, they said, can you imagine China 10 years from now deploying its aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf the way that we do? And my answer to that was yes, but when the Chinese government tells you no, I don't think they're lying, right? Because a lot of times what happens is, as you develop more capability, then you're able to influence interest a little bit differently, and you're not always thinking about all the ways that you're going to use those instruments of power when you develop them. So I certainly see that as China's interests are growing globally, that they will bring that type of military power to bear there. So take two examples that are worth highlighting. One, when things became complicated in Yemen, there were Chinese nationals that were there, and China executed humevac operations NEO operations from Yemen. Similarly, when Libya became complicated, China had an interest in ensuring that its citizens were able to get out of there safely, and they used the Chinese elements of the Chinese military to do that as well. So as China's interests grow globally, it's only natural that you would see that you should expect to see that there will be elements of Chinese military power there to protect those interests.
Thanks, Scott. Let's go over here. Yep. Yep, second row. Yep.
Hi, my name is Allie Kane. I'm a graduate student here at the European Institute. I had a question for Shelby. I know that you said that election interference is a global problem, but it obviously impacts Europe quite significantly. So I was wondering, to what extent does the U.S. intelligence service work closely with either the EU as a whole or certain European countries? And then I had another question, which was, I agree with you 100% that I think the awareness of election interference has to become more ingrained in our society. And I'm wondering what role the intelligence community can play in that, considering that there's so much gridlock in Congress, and recently Mitch McConnell voted to block certain election security measures. So is there a greater role that the intelligence community can play in spreading that awareness? Thank you.
And Mitch McConnell has changed his mind, so we now have $250 million going to the states, but that's DHS's problem. But it did come 24 hours after we briefed him on election security. Coincidence? I don't know. But anyways, so I think one of the areas of momentum that we have within the intelligence community is our relationship with foreign partners and allies. So we go back many, many decades, most specifically with many of our European allies for long periods of time. And so that's an excellent foundation, frankly, with which to step off and continue that exchange on election security. And election security is really an amalgamation of existing intelligence work. It's counterintelligence, it's cybersecurity, and it's the regional expertise in China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, hacktivists, what have you. And so those are already existing intelligence topics that we work with our international partners. So as I said, I think we have a bit of a running start and momentum where we can then harness that relationship already and then talk a bit about how that's manifesting itself relative to election security, whether it's within a specific European country or broadly across the EU. So we already have a running start with many, if not most, of our partners. I think it has been interesting to work more closely with the EU. The EU is certainly a bit of a different animal than, let's say, NATO or other multilateral organizations because it has such a strong economic focus. But what's important for my work relative to the EU is because so many of the ministers of the interior cooperate under the EU rubric that it is really important to break out of just the traditional national security relationship and work with the EU. So for me, I think that's been a good start. What is challenging, however, is to what extent you talk generally about election security, but there's always a domestic twist to that work. And so I think where I think where this is evolving is to what extent are you willing and wanting to talk about your own domestic vulnerabilities and political situation with a foreign partner. That can always be a bit of uncharted territory, and I think we're working that out. Remind me of your second question. I got preoccupied with Mitch McConnell. Yeah. So I think what's exciting, if I can put this, about election security is that I don't necessarily need Congress per se to have an enhanced relationship with all other sectors of society. So for example, the National Intelligence Council, and many of my colleagues here have worked on the National Intelligence Council, which is part of the ODNI, already has a mandate to work very closely with academia. And so I think there's already a natural relationship and opportunity to further work on these topics where perhaps we can, whether that's through grant money or whether that's through our natural relationship that exists with academia, to talk about the topics and gaps that we see in the work that we can do within the intelligence community and take that a step further and say maybe that's a partnership. And I also think the state and local election officials, frankly, those are your secretaries of state, and they want to have relationships with the academic community, the societies within their states, and have them continue to do this work, whether that's on cyber or countering influence operations. So again, I think there's a natural foundation already laid. It's just, and this is where I think, kind of nurturing this ecosystem, as I mentioned later in my talk, is where we want to be able, I think, to talk more openly about these challenges and kind of work together on an agreed upon framework. And I think right now everybody's just not totally there yet and is working on this discipline, but there's a bit more collaboration and coordination that I think would help us all.
Okay, so we're going to go to a lightning round. So there's one-part questions, no two or three. Okay, let's go in the back. Yep.
My question is directed at Scott. In regards to China's power modernization, how do you feel that force employment and force management is in the gap between United States and China in regards to the military development and modernization?
Well, I mean, without a doubt, the United States has a global military presence, global military capability today, right? What we can still do is uniquely project power anywhere in the world, anytime, for just about as long as we need to do that, right? We're still in the Middle East, right, for a little while. So that's something that the United States can uniquely do. And I'll tell you, when I served at the embassy in Beijing a decade ago, more than a decade ago now, when the United States provided some relief supplies after an earthquake, one of the things that I think was most surprising to Beijing was our ability to, 24 hours after China said, yes, we'll take it, to have C-17s landing full of relief supplies that were right there. And the part that was most impressive, I think, was it wasn't anything special for us, right? Where had those C-17s been the day before? Somewhere else in the world doing something similar. So that's just what we do. For Beijing, projecting power a long way away is still a big deal. Now, they've been doing it for a long time in the Gulf of Aden, right? So there's got an extended presence there. So it's still a challenge for Beijing. It's still it's a big to-do for Beijing to do that. So we still certainly have a huge advantage there. But it's something that as Beijing develops a military base in Djibouti, potential other military bases in other parts of the world, then it becomes a little bit easier for China to do that. But for now, that's still something that we can uniquely do.
The interesting thing there for me when I was in government was our U.S. military, and I was in the military, right? The military's ability to project power is unparalleled. The other agencies of government that we need to be able to do the same thing, state, USAID, et cetera, that's eroded in my view, and that misalignment is actually a problem over time. Yep. Did you want to ask? No. Yeah, you guys, your hand up. Yeah. Yep. I got you before your hand went up.
Good,
I knew what you were
preemptive strike. Chris, can you talk a little bit about the Aramco attacks on their facilities? I think when we thought about critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, usually you think in terms of cyber, but a UAS cruise missile attack was a little different than what people expected. How much more of a problem will it be? Is it easily addressable? Is it a risk we're going to have to live with for a while?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't be the first person. I've read a lot in the wake of those attacks. I've read a lot in open source materials about this new frontier that isn't so new anymore. Look, Iran especially, but other actors as well globally, have spent the last 28 years since Desert Storm picking apart everything that the U.S. does in terms of capabilities, capacity, a way of war, and finding the vulnerabilities in those capabilities, and finding chinks in the armor, right? And Iran is at the forefront of that. They've been doing that all the way back to the Iran-Iraq War, and this is no different. And that applies as well because so many of our partners have bought our capabilities and have bought our operating doctrine, so it applies to them as well, and the Saudis being a case in point. And I don't want to get too much into operational and, as we say, J3 issues, because I'm on the intel side, not the operational side. It's things that we have to address. But there should be no surprise here that Iran has been developing. I remember when the Iranians first bought cruise missiles from, I think it was Belarus back in the 2000s. And we kind of scoffed because they were Alcoms, air launched, and they didn't have a platform that was capable of launching these, and they eventually adapted them for ground launch, and they've created other kinds of air-launched cruise missiles that play to the vulnerabilities in our air defense system. And I think those are going to be capabilities that we are going to have to address going forward because they're not going away.
This goes to the point, though, that I mentioned in the beginning of the evening about are we investing in the West in the right stuff? So if the drones reportedly cost $10,000 or so, and the Saudis spend roughly $70 billion a year on defense, and 10 of them can take out half of the production capability, you have some kind of misalignment going on there as well. So we need to think through that deeply as a country. So whenever I hear defense numbers cited, it doesn't impress me. It's what are you spending it on?
By the way, I would also add that there's something to be said about context here as well. If we were in a full-on conflict, things would be different. The air surveillance picture would be different. There would probably be U.S. AWACS up. There would be a combat air patrol. None of this was going on at the time, was in effect at the time of these attacks. No one expected them, right? So context as well as capability matters. The conditions under which the conflict is taking place. The defenses that we have designed are designed more around the general conflict than they are, this sort of out of the blue kind of.
Let's go over to this side of the room, in the middle there. Your hand up. Yep. Oh, the one in the front here. Yep. Yep.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Liam Brown. I'm actually a freshman at Columbia College. And my question can go to any of you. I think nearly all of you brought up the fact that cyber attacks happen against the U.S. fairly frequently and from a variety of actors and to a variety in severity as well. So my question is, what do you think the criteria should be in order for the U.S. to respond to a cyber attack, whether that response is conventional or offensive cyber response? Thank you.
What do you think, Scott?
Yeah.
I was going to pitch to you, Shelby. That's when it comes to questions about threshold of what a policymaker should do, I'm the intel guy. My job is I'll go describe the problem to them quite well.
It's the best part of our job.
It is the best part of our job.
Yeah,
exactly. There is nothing better than being able to just say, well, it sounds like a policy problem. My wife, by the way, is a policymaker, and I got to tell you, it's sometimes fun just to say, "Sorry, dear, that's a policy issue. That's your issue, not mine." Doesn't go over very well at home. She's probably watching. This is not a good idea. So I'll tell you that ultimately that's a policymaker's call. But what I will say is, when it comes to the things that we see, whether it's China or North Korea or other advanced cyber actors doing. It used to be that the type of cyber activities that you saw were these very noisy, one director of national intelligence, I believe, once publicly said it was almost rude. They were so noisy, right? It was just, they were just ever-present and easy to see. That's not what happens now. Right, so the degree of sophistication that we see in Chinese cyber activities has grown pretty sharply. And you take a country like North Korea. Do you think of North Korea as being a technologically advanced country? That's not normally the first place that you go to when you think about North Korea. And yet, North Korea is able to pull off some pretty impressive cyber actions that we've seen against commercial entities in the United States, a good bit of activity that targets banking systems. I mean, there's quite a degree of sophistication there. So the type of problems that we see come from a number of actors, and they are increasingly sophisticated.
So here's the thing, and I'll throw it back to you, because I mentioned in the beginning of the evening that we have a lot of work to do in establishing norms, right? So cyber is one area, but so is the drone technology that I just talked about, so is autonomous weapons, in addition to the drones, so is synthetic biology. There are all of these new emerging areas of technology, cyber is class artificial intelligence, where the great powers and allies need to think deeply about how far do we want to go down a path. Because I don't think it is well established in certain areas. And it goes back to what Scott said before about how great powers can stumble into conflict. A satellite goes out in orbit. Was it an accident, or was it the precursor to some kind of other strike that we need to worry about? So arms control has kind of lost its allure and appeal in recent years. I think we need it back, and we need to think deeply about what should be in that category. I have one question that I want to get from the Twitterverse, and we've only got a couple more minutes. So, Chris, this is for you, and I'm only going to ask you the first part of it. Does the U.S. in its strategy vis-a-vis Iran view Iran still as a rational actor?
Yes, but there's always a but, right? In the intelligence community, there's always a qualification. A rational actor, and I can't believe I'm about to say this in front of a room full of graduate students in international studies, but a rational actor is someone who can make a cost-benefit analysis absent of an emotional content, right, an emotional influence, and come to a decision. The problem is that means that we view Iran as being capable of doing that. But that doesn't mean that everyone who is a rational actor, and this is what I call rational actor abuse, I see often, people say, well, they wouldn't do that, they're a rational actor. But what they're really saying is, I wouldn't do that, but they're using rational actor as the excuse. So as a quotidian example, all of us are rational actors, with possible the exception of Scott, but we're all rational actors, and if you gave us $40,000 and said, go buy a car, that doesn't mean that we're all going to go buy the same car. We will all, and we can all do it absent of emotion, but we can all go out and say, well, I am more about mileage. Scott wants four-wheel drive. Shelby wants acceleration because she's a bit of a lead foot, right? We could all, again, come to a different decision on what is essentially the same, the same choice, and all be rational actors. And so when you say, well, Iran is rational, therefore they won't go to war or they won't risk war, you're running into a very tricky analytical, problem there, because you're in some ways mirror imaging what you consider to be rational on them, and they may be making a decision that, and this, by the way, applies to China, it applies to North Korea, it applies across the board. Yes, I think Iran is a rational actor, but that does not necessarily mean they will make the decision that we think that they were going to make, or that we would make in their place.
Okay, so that is the end of the official part of the evening. I think some of us might be willing to stick around for a few minutes after it. I do want to remind you to visit the Center on Global Energy Policy online. And for the students in the room, I would say, look, you have a ton of expertise up here in the panel, but nobody in Washington has, certainly nobody in Washington has all the answers. So I would recommend staying engaged, let your voice be part of the conversation to figure out these big issues that we're grappling with, and consider careers in national security because it's worthwhile. And we're hiring, yeah. Thank you.